All right. Well, we're going to have this discussion because I think that right away the emotions get control of us. And so, the president federalizing National Guard troops, federal agents on the streets in D.C., 23 people arrested, including murder suspects, and people had gun offenses, were arrested on the first night. But there's a number of people that are acting like, what are federal agents doing here? We should let local police handle this. To address the issue of the partnership between federal agents and local law enforcement and the history of that is someone that spent over 30 years with the FBI. His name is Steve Hooper. He's now a professor at Embry-Riddle's College of Business Security and Intelligence and an expert in all of these areas. Steve, it's good to talk to you again.
Hi, Mike. Good morning.
Back to work. Your summer's over. Back to work.
That's right.
So let's jump into this. Can you talk a little bit about the history of local law enforcement partnering with federal law enforcement, whether it's task forces or working on specific areas of crime? This is nothing new, is it?
No, and that's it's being posed as some sort of, knee-jerk reaction that we're putting federal agents on the street with cops. I can tell you, going back to January of 1992. The 80s was the evolution, late 70s through the 80s was the evolution of the Crips and Bloods, and then the crack cocaine epidemic, and that rolled throughout the country. And so street gangs, drug gangs became the most violent parts of any city. And so cities were getting, quite literally killed because they could not keep up with the gang activity. One of the first cities, or the first city, to approach the FBI for help was Washington, D.C. I was in the Washington field office when this happened, and my wife, Linda, and she was on the Safe Streets Task Force. The mayor walked into the FBI building and asked the boss, who was back then a special agent in charge, now an assistant director, heads up the FBI field office in Washington, D.C. But the mayor walked into the office and said, "We need your help." And the FBI joined forces with D.C. police, Park Police, some of the neighboring towns, Alexandria, Arlington, Prince George's County, Maryland, and put together the first ever Safe Streets Task Force. And it was a combination of all the police departments and the FBI, and the first time in history that the FBI was now out working with police on the streets of D.C. and taking down the gangs. It was hugely effective, and the gangs were essentially eliminated in D.C. And that happened in 1992 and throughout the 90s. And so it was 9/11 that changed and moved a lot of the resources, obviously, to counterterrorism. But to me, this is just the pendulum swinging back.
When you look at it, when you talk about that pendulum swinging back, the force of the FBI and the tools at your disposal, and marrying the two of these ideas that you're talking about, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the JTTFs, isn't that effectively on the terrorism side of things the same thing you're talking about, a task force where local and federal law enforcement partner together to fight crime?
Exactly. It was that was a watershed time period for the FBI and local police, because throughout the 80s, the FBI did their thing and the local police did their thing. The only thing we did together was respond to bank robberies. It was in the early 90s when all these task forces were starting to develop. And then, in the 90s, all agencies started joining forces and combating each of the elements that came along, the criminal acts, and whether that was gangs. And then, of course, in the mid-90s, terrorism started to rear its head with attacks overseas. And then, of course, 9/11, in 93, the first attempt on the Twin Towers, that rose the level of concern and started the foundation of a counterterrorism division at FBI headquarters. And then, of course, 9/11 changed it completely. But the FBI working with state and local police goes back to the early 90s for lots of programs.
The FBI Director Kash Patel was talking about an operation they did recently in Northern Virginia that was very successful, and it resulted in over 500 felons being arrested. So he was actually saying this is something that we continue to do. For an operation like this, based on your experience, what do federal law enforcement, other than being other law enforcement bodies on the street, what do they add to the D.C. police? What is added here by them being there? And what is the difference having the Trump administration federalizing and taking over operations versus city leadership?
Well, with federal involvement comes the ability to charge federal crimes. And with federal crimes, that's enhanced sentencing. And also the ability to conduct transnational criminal operations, investigations, which means the FBI has access outside of the country, and a lot of these things impact this. But the ability to charge a local criminal with a federal charge has impact because the federal sentencing guidelines are so much stricter than the local ones. So it takes it out of you heard the U.S. Attorney from D.C. saying that her hands are tied when it comes to sentencing some of these people. They get released by local attorneys general or state's attorneys and so forth. With the federal charges, that wouldn't happen. So it adds resources. It adds technology. It adds capability. I mean, there's lots of techniques, surveillance and different things otherwise that come to play. And then also the more strict sentencing guidelines by charging them with federal crimes.
So last question is off of this topic, but I'm sure you've seen the story where Mexico has announced that they are sending, I think it's 26 cartel leaders to the U.S. and extraditing them for prosecution here in the U.S. We think this is a very big deal, that it's sending a message to the cartels. You are not going to find safe haven in Mexico. If you commit crimes in the U.S., you're going to face the music. As far back as crimes and murders that happened back in 1985, is this a big story for the American people to know that Mexico is working with us to extradite criminals that have committed crimes on our streets?
Well, I can tell you that as far back as I can remember, including me, I wrote a paper for school on it, but experts who know a lot more than I do have been calling for the cartels to be labeled foreign terrorist organizations for as far back as I can remember. Guys at the highest levels, FBI headquarters, CIA headquarters, there are lots of very, very smart and knowledgeable people that were calling for that and felt it was justified. And this is exactly why. As soon as this was done, Mexico realized all bets are off now. It's one thing to try to arrest our way out of this by catching the drug dealers when they bring the drugs in, but it's another thing if they're foreign terrorist organizations, the ability to go after them in another country and use the techniques and laws that were put on the books after 9/11. So the ability for us to get to the leaders of the cartels in other countries has expanded. And I believe, my opinion, the president of Mexico realizes that and says, okay, we need to get out ahead of this. Because, right, one of her statements was, we can handle it here. We don't need you to come into our country. Because they know if they're a foreign terrorist organization designated by the United States, we're coming to get them. So
I think that's a big step that they're taking in Mexico, like you said, to get in front of it. Steve, it's always good to talk with you. I appreciate you coming on, and I'd love to have you on more often.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
All right, that's Steve Hooper spending a few moments with us.
Thanks for watching the Mike Broomhead Show. Tap to watch and listen to the new season of Amazing Arizonans, a KTAR News podcast. You can also click the button in the middle to subscribe.